When an undercover CEO spotted a worker sneaking food from the trash, he never expected the heartbreaking truth behind it. When Carl opened the trash bin, he expected garbage. What he didn't expect was a young man, trembling, clutching a half-eaten sandwich like his life depended on it. Carl's heart sank. As CEO, he'd built this company to take care of his employees. So how had things gotten this bad? Carl Whitman stood in front of his warehouse, zipping up a faded grey hoodie. His usual tailored suits and polished shoes were replaced by worn jeans and scuffed sneakers. He blended in, just another middle-aged guy looking for work. That's exactly what he wanted. For weeks, rumors had trickled in. Complaints about poor conditions, overworked employees, and whispers of theft. Carl needed to see it himself. He stepped inside and was greeted by a rush of cold air and the relentless hum of conveyor belts. Towering shelves stretched from wall to wall, workers darting between them like ants, stacking boxes and scanning. Labels. "Hey, you here for the new shift?" a gravelly voice called out. Carl turned to see a bulky man in a black hoodie, clipboard in hand. "I'm Frank, floor supervisor. You're late." "Sorry," Carl mumbled. "Grab a vest and get moving." Frank didn't wait for a reply. Carl grabbed a neon yellow vest from a nearby hook and hurried after Frank. The man barked instructions, pointing out packing stations, loading zones, and emergency exits like he was reciting a prayer. "Don't mess around," Frank warned. "We're on tight deadlines." Carl's first task was simple: sorting boxes. He stacked, scanned, and taped packages alongside the other workers. But as he observed the team, he noticed something troubling. They moved fast, too fast. People were skipping breaks, chugging water while still packing boxes. A woman a few feet away winced as she clutched her wrist but kept going. No one seemed willing to stop. "Tired?" Carl asked the young man beside him, a wiry kid with dark hair sticking out from under a baseball cap. His name tag read, Evan. "Yeah," Evan muttered. "But I can't fall behind. They dock our pay if we don't hit our quotas." Carl's stomach turned. "Docked pay?" He never authorized that. "Breaks in 10, Carl said, his voice gentle. "Make sure you take it." Evan shot him a weak smile, but Carl had a sinking feeling that Evan wouldn't stop working. By lunchtime, Carl's arms ached, but his mind was racing. The warehouse ran like a machine. Efficient, yes, but brutal. Frank's sharp eyes missed nothing, and no one dared question him. The fear in their faces reminded Carl of stories his father once told about factories from the early 1900s. Harsh conditions, little rest, and workers seen as nothing more than cogs in the system. Carl grabbed a stale sandwich from the vending machine and stepped outside. As he ate, he noticed Evan lingering near the back door. The young man kept glancing around nervously before slipping inside, not through the main door, but into the shadowed loading dock. Curious, Carl followed at a distance. He crept through the dimly lit corridor, the air heavy with the scent of oil and cardboard. Turning a corner, he froze. Evan knelt by a large trash bin, digging through discarded food containers. Carl's breath caught as Evan pulled out a half-eaten sandwich, brushing off crumbs before taking a desperate bite. Carl stepped forward. "Evan?" The young man jumped to his feet, sandwich still in hand, his face pale. I was just... "It's okay," Carl said quickly, raising his hands, to show he wasn't angry. Are you hungry?" Evan's face reddened. "I'm fine," he mumbled, but Carl could see the shame in his eyes. The kid looked exhausted and painfully thin. "Why don't you grab something from the break room?" Carl offered. "I'll cover it." Evan let out a bitter laugh. "Break room's been locked since last month. They said it's to cut costs. Even the microwave's gone." He gestured to the trash bin. "Sometimes guys throw out food they don't finish. I just grab whatever's left." Carl's chest tightened. This wasn't just about efficiency or quotas. His people were suffering, and no one had told him. "I'm Carl," he said, extending his hand. "First day here." Evan eyed him cautiously before shaking his hand. "Evan." Listen, Evan, Carl said, lowering his voice. Things are going to change. Evan's skeptical expression said it all. Sure, he muttered, tossing the sandwich back into the bin and walking away. Carl stood frozen, heart heavy. Whatever had happened inside this warehouse, he'd let it go on far too long, and now he knew exactly where to start fixing it. Robert couldn't get the image of Carl out of his mind. The sight of the young man huddled behind crates, scarfing down a half-eaten sandwich from the trash, haunted him. Each time Robert tried to focus on packing boxes or stacking shelves, his mind circled back to one painful question. How had things gotten this bad? By the time the evening shift rolled around, Robert's curiosity had turned into quiet determination. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. "Hey, Carl!" Robert called out, catching up with him near the loading dock. Carl's head shot up like he'd been caught doing something wrong. "Yeah?" Robert tried to sound casual. "I was going to grab some coffee after work. You want to come?" "My treat." Carl blinked in surprise. I don't know. Come on." Robert smiled. "It's just coffee." Carl hesitated for a moment longer before giving a small shrug. "Yeah. Okay." They ended up at a worn-down diner a few blocks from the warehouse. The place was dimly lit, with faded menus taped to the walls and the faint scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Carl sat hunched in his seat, stirring his cup with a plastic spoon like he didn't know what to say. "So," Robert began carefully, "how long have you been at the warehouse?" 5 months, Carl muttered. "Just about. You like it there?" Carl let out a quiet laugh, the kind that wasn't really a laugh at all. "It's a job, pays enough to keep the lights on." "Does it?" Robert pressed gently. "I mean, if you're digging food out of the trash." Carl's spoon froze, his face flushed red, and for a second, Robert thought he might get up and leave. "Sorry," Robert said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Carl muttered. He slumped back, in his seat, eyes fixed on his coffee. "Look, my mum's been sick, bad sick, heart problems. Doctor said she can't work anymore. I send everything I can back home." His voice cracked slightly. "Rent, groceries, meds aren't cheap, you." "No?" Robert nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know." Carl rubbed the back of his neck. "I tried to pick up extra shifts, but Frank, the supervisor, he only hands those out to his buddies. Said I wasn't cut out for overtime." Carl's eyes hardened. "I just take what's left." "And they're docking your pay too?" Robert asked. "Yeah," Carl said bitterly. "If you don't hit your quota, they start cutting your hours, even if you're only off by a few boxes. Happens to a lot of us. No one wants to complain, though. They're too scared Frank will find out." Robert clenched his teeth. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was cruelty. "But why the trash?" Robert asked softly. "There are food, banks, shelters." Carl swallowed hard. "I go sometimes," he said. "But if I take too long on my break, Frank gets mad. Threatened to fire me once when I came back late." He shook his head. "I can't risk losing this job. I just grab what I can." Robert stared at the young man across the table, his heart twisting in his chest. He thought about the glowing reports he'd read from upper management, all boasting record profits and efficient operations. Meanwhile, here was Carl, working himself to exhaustion, skipping breaks and eating from a garbage bin just to survive. Somewhere along the way, Robert's company had lost its soul. The next morning, Robert returned to the warehouse, still disguised as just another worker. This time, though, his focus wasn't on packing boxes, it was on Frank. Frank was loud, aggressive, and far too comfortable in his position. He barked orders, slamming his clipboard on tables when things didn't move fast enough. But what disturbed Robert most was how employees shrank when Frank was near. Heads down, backs bent, as if they were afraid to be noticed. "Carl!" Frank's voice thundered from across the floor. Robert turned just in time to see Frank stomping toward him. "Why is this shipment still sitting here?" Carl froze mid-step, his eyes wide. I'm almost done. Almost doesn't cut it, Frank snapped. You're always dragging behind. Maybe I should just take you off the schedule altogether. Carl's face paled. Please, I just need… Yeah? Frank sneered. Well, maybe what you need is to find a new job. That's enough. The words were out before Robert realized he'd said them. The room went still. Frank turned, narrowing his eyes. Who the hell are you? Just someone who knows what hard work looks like, Robert shot back. And this? This isn't how you treat people. Frank's lip curled. Oh yeah? Well, if you think you know better, why don't you pack this order yourself? Gladly, Robert said through gritted teeth. For the next 20 minutes, Robert worked furiously, packing boxes faster than he thought possible. His muscles ached, but he refused to stop. Employees whispered as they watched, not just because Robert was matching pace, but because someone was finally standing up to Frank. By the time Robert finished, sweat clung to his shirt. He wiped his forehead, panting. See? Frank barked. You're not special. Anyone can do this job. Robert smirked. Yeah, but I didn't have to threaten anyone to get it done. Frank's face darkened, but before he could respond, Robert reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and flipped it open, revealing his CEO ID badge. The room went dead silent. Frank's expression twisted from anger to shock. I own this company, Robert said firmly. And starting today, things are going to change. Frank stood frozen, his face pale as Robert's CEO badge gleamed in the dim warehouse light. The employees around them stared wide-eyed, whispering to each other in stunned disbelief. Some looked relieved, while others seemed unsure what to think. You're the CEO? Frank stammered, voice cracking. That's right, Robert said, his voice cold. And I've spent the past 2 days watching you humiliate employees, abuse your position, and let good people suffer under your leadership. Frank's face twisted into an uneasy grin. Look, I was just… Stop. Robert's sharp tone silenced him. You've had your chance. Pack your things. You're fired. The room stayed quiet for a beat, then Carl, still standing nearby, exhaled loudly. Relief swept across his face. A few other employees exchanged glances, cautiously hopeful. You can't do this, Frank blurted out. You can't run this place without me. Oh, I'm not just doing this here, Robert shot back. Starting today, I'm reviewing management across all my warehouses, and anyone like you is done. Frank's expression hardened as he stormed toward the exit. On his way out, he shot Carl a venomous glare. Hope you're happy now, Frank spat, before disappearing through the door. The moment Frank was gone, the entire room seemed to breathe easier. One worker clapped, then another. Within seconds, the warehouse erupted in quiet applause. Carl stood there, still looking shocked. Don't worry, Robert said, placing a reassuring hand on Carl's shoulder. I'm not done yet. Later that afternoon, Robert gathered the warehouse staff in the break room, the same break room that had been locked for weeks. He'd personally reopened it that morning and filled it with fresh food, water, and supplies. Employees grabbed snacks and drinks as they trickled in, their tired faces softening as they realized someone had finally noticed their struggles. Robert stood at the front, facing the group. I know things haven't been fair here, he began. I trusted the wrong people to manage this place, and as a result, you've been overworked, mistreated, and disrespected. That changes now. The room stayed silent, but the tension was different this time. Less fearful, more curious. First, Robert continued, no more unpaid overtime or quotas designed to force you to fail. Breaks will be mandatory, and anyone who denies you one is gone. The workers exchanged looks, some quietly murmuring to each other. Second, Robert added, I'm hiring more staff so you're not stretched so thin. And anyone who's been unfairly overlooked for extra shifts will get a chance now. Carl's head shot up at that. And lastly, Robert said firmly, wages are going up, starting next week. No one working full-time at this company should struggle to put food on the table. Period. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone clapped. tentatively at first, but it grew. Soon the whole room erupted in applause. Employees smiled, some even laughing with relief. "I know talk is cheap," Robert said once the applause died down, "but I promise you, I'll be visiting other warehouses personally. I want to make sure this never happens again." Carl raised his hand. Are you really serious about all this?" "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't," Robert replied. "I built this company to take care of people, and somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. It's time I fix what's broken." Carl gave a small nod, then lowered his head, visibly trying to hold back emotion. Robert knew what that moment meant. It wasn't just about a policy change. It was about giving people like Carl hope again. By the end of the day, the warehouse felt different. The air wasn't heavy with exhaustion anymore. It felt lighter, calmer. Employees smiled as they worked, and when Carl passed Robert on the way out, he paused. "Thanks," Carl said quietly, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Robert said with a small smile. "I've still got a lot to fix." Carl grinned, for the first time that day. "Yeah, but this is a good start." As Robert stepped outside, he felt the cold evening air hit his face. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel weighed down. He'd come here to fix a problem. What he'd found was much bigger than that. But now, for the first time, he knew exactly what needed to be done, and this time, he wouldn't fail his employees again. The following week, Robert returned to the warehouse, this time without his disguise. He walked in wearing a sharp blazer and dress shoes, his CEO badge clipped clearly to his jacket. Employees paused mid-task as they noticed him, whispering to one another. Carl was the first to approach. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," he said with a small grin. "I told you I wasn't finished," Robert replied. He wasn't just back to make promises. He was here to deliver. The employees gathered in the break room once again. This time, there were no grim faces or guarded stares, just quiet curiosity. Robert stood at the front of the room, a clipboard in hand. "First," Robert began, "I want you all to know that every complaint you made, every concern you voiced, has been addressed." He glanced at Carl. "Including the ones no one was willing to say out loud." Carl shifted slightly, clearly remembering the food he'd scavenged from the trash. "Starting today," Robert continued, "we've implemented a revised break policy across every warehouse. No more denied breaks, no more rushed meals, and no more locked break rooms." He pointed to the far corner, where the previously empty shelves were now fully stocked with fresh snacks, bottled water, and meal options. "We've also doubled the cleaning staff to make sure this place stays safe," Robert added. "I know some of you have been working in conditions you should never have been subjected to. That's ending now." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. "And there's one more thing," Robert said. "I know many of you have been shorted on hours or forced to take pay cuts unfairly. That's being corrected immediately. And anyone who lost wages in the last 6 months is being reimbursed." At that, a few employees gasped. Carl's eyes widened. "Wait, seriously?" "Seriously," Robert confirmed. "You've worked hard. You deserve to be paid fairly for it." The room erupted into applause. For weeks, months even, they had felt powerless. Now, for the first time, they believed change was real. By midday, the warehouse floor buzzed with energy, but not the frantic, pressure-filled chaos it had been before. Employees took turns on break, without fear of getting yelled at. The vending machines were stocked. Workers smiled more. Some even joked as they worked. The atmosphere was calmer, healthier. Carl passed Robert near the packing station, pausing with a hesitant smile. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "So, I heard Frank's replacements are starting next week?" "That's right," Robert said. "Properly trained this time." Carl glanced toward the loading dock. "You know, you could have just fired Frank and left it at that. Most people wouldn't have cared after that." Robert smiled faintly. "I care. Carl seemed to think for a moment, then cleared his throat. Well, thanks. For everything. Don't mention it, Robert said. Just promise me something. Yeah? If you ever feel like you can't speak up, if anyone here feels that way, tell me, or tell someone who will listen. Robert's expression turned serious. I didn't know what was happening in my own company, because no one thought I'd care. That's on me, but it's never happening again. Carl nodded firmly. Yeah, I'll make sure of it. As Robert left the warehouse that evening, he couldn't help but smile. The place still had its flaws. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but the difference was undeniable. His employees were no longer afraid. They knew they mattered, and this time, Robert was determined to make sure they never doubted it again. 1 month later, Robert stood in the parking lot of the same warehouse that had once left him deeply ashamed. Only this time, he wasn't undercover, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of corporate managers, people Robert had handpicked, gathered to watch the day unfold. Today wasn't just about checking in. It was about ensuring that every change Robert promised was being carried out, not just here, but in every warehouse under his company's name. Let's see how they're doing, Robert said, stepping through the familiar doors. The difference was obvious the moment they entered. The air felt lighter. The tension that had once smothered the warehouse was gone. Employees moved with purpose, not frantic desperation, but steady efficiency. Conversations flowed between co-workers. Laughter, something that had been painfully absent before, rang out from the break room. Robert couldn't help but smile. Looks normal, one of the managers muttered. Yeah, Robert agreed. That's what's supposed to happen when people actually feel valued. As Robert walked the floor, employees recognized him, but not with the fearful glances he'd seen weeks ago. Instead, they smiled and nodded as he passed. Some shook his hand. Others clapped him on the back like an old friend. Near the packing station, Carl was stacking boxes. But unlike before, his movements weren't sluggish or weary. He looked energized, focused, and, most noticeably, calm. Carl, Robert greeted with a smile. How's it going? Carl grinned. Better, a lot better. He gestured toward the busy floor. Feels like a different place now. Everyone's, I don't know. He shrugged. Less afraid, I guess. Good, Robert said firmly. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Carl grabbed a nearby clipboard, flipping through it quickly. Oh, I almost forgot. The guys from night shift wanted me to tell you thanks. A couple of them got those back pay checks you promised. He chuckled. I think one of them almost cried. Robert's smile widened. I'm glad. They earned it. Carl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You know, he began slowly. I really didn't believe it would change. Not at first. He gave Robert an earnest look. But you actually did what you said you'd do. I told you I'd fix it, Robert said softly. I don't take that lightly. Later, that afternoon, Robert stood in the break room, which was now fully stocked with fresh food, snacks, and a new microwave. Employees chatted as they ate, no longer rushing or sneaking food like Carl once had. Robert leaned against the wall, quietly observing the room. For weeks, he had been overwhelmed with regret, haunted by the reality that his employees had suffered while he remained blind to their struggles. But now, watching his employees laugh and unwind, he felt something different. Something better. Pride. Sir? Robert turned to see Carl standing in the doorway. Heading out? Robert asked. Yeah, just finished up, Carl said. He hesitated for a moment before adding, I'm thinking about taking some classes. Accounting, maybe. Robert's brow lifted. That's great. Yeah. Carl smiled sheepishly. I figured maybe one day I could be doing what you're doing. Something better. He gave a nervous chuckle. You know, without the whole undercover part. Robert laughed. I think you do a great job. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to Carl. "When you're ready, give me a call. We'll figure something out." Carl stared at the card in his hand like it was worth a fortune. "Seriously?" "Seriously," Robert said with a smile. "You've got potential. Don't waste it." For a moment, Carl just stood there, unsure how to respond. Then he extended his hand. "Thanks, Mr. Whitman, for everything." Robert shook his hand firmly. "Don't mention it. Just promise me one thing." "Sure. Never let someone like Frank push you around again." Carl grinned. "Deal." As Carl walked out the door, Robert leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. His company still had a long road ahead, but this time he knew it was heading in the right direction. For the first time in a long time, Robert Whitman felt like a leader again.